The streets of downtown Seattle gleamed under the yellow streetlights, puddles from the earlier rain reflecting the neon signs of late-night establishments. Officer Mike Chen wasn't supposed to be working that night, but his colleague had called in sick, and the department was already short-staffed. He cancelled his dinner plans with his daughter, promising to make it up to her over the weekend. The clock on his patrol car dashboard showed 11:45 p.m. when he turned onto Pine Street. Most shops were closed, their windows dark and shuttered, except for the 24-hour convenience store on the corner. The store's harsh fluorescent lights spilled onto the wet sidewalk, where a group of teenagers had gathered, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings. Mike had seen groups like this before, kids from good families, probably living in those expensive apartments up on Capitol Hill, looking for cheap thrills on a Thursday night. He wouldn't have stopped if he hadn't noticed the beer bottles they were trying to hide behind their backs. One girl in particular caught his attention. She wore an expensive-looking leather jacket and had an attitude that screamed privileged. Just another routine check, he muttered to himself, flicking on his patrol car's lights. But something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working double shifts all week, or the lingering frustration from missing his daughter's school event yesterday. Whatever it was, it made his shoulders tense as he stepped out of the car. The teens immediately shifted, forming a loose circle. Some pulled out their phones, while others backed away toward the store's entrance. But the girl in the leather jacket stood her ground, casually swinging an empty beer bottle by her side. She couldn't have been more than 16. "Evening, folks," Mike called out, his boots splashing through a puddle as he approached. "Little late to be hanging around here, isn't it?" The group mumbled various excuses, but Leather Jacket Girl just smirked. "Is there a curfew I don't know about, officer?" Her words carried a hint of mockery that made Mike's jaw clench. "No curfew," he replied, his flashlight beam sweeping across the scattered beer bottles at their feet. "But there are laws about underage drinking. IDs out, please." Most of the teens complied, fumbling for their wallets. But not her. She took a step forward, the empty bottle dangling from her fingers like a taunt. "My dad says cops these days are all about harassment." Guess he was right. Mike had dealt with countless attitude-heavy teenagers over his 15 years on the force. Usually he let comments like that roll off his back. But something about this girl, maybe her smirk, or the way she stood there like she owned the street, got under his skin. He noticed her friends shifting nervously, some already backing away. A few had their phones out, recording. The smart ones were leaving, disappearing into the darkness beyond the store's lights. But this girl, she was playing a game she didn't understand. The air felt electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Mike could feel his training slipping, replaced by something more personal, more dangerous. He should have called for backup, should have taken a deep breath, should have remembered the de-escalation techniques they'd practiced just last month. Instead, he took a step closer, his figure casting a long shadow across the wet pavement. The girl's smirk wavered for just a moment, but she didn't back down. And that's when Mike made a decision that would change multiple lives forever, though he didn't know it yet. The convenience store's security camera silently recorded everything. The officer's approach, the girl's defiant stance, the scatter of nervous teenagers, and the empty beer bottle that would soon become the center of a story that would rock the entire city. None of them knew they were about to become front-page news. None of them realized that in just a few minutes, everything would change. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and a few drops of rain began to fall, but neither the officer nor the girl seemed to notice. They were locked in a battle of wills, and neither was willing to back down. The real storm was about to begin. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the convenience store's metal awning. Officer Mike Shen's patience was wearing dangerously thin. Every fiber of his being told him to walk away, to handle this by the book. But something about this girl's attitude had triggered something in him. Maybe it was how she reminded him of the rich kids who used to bully his daughter at school. "Hand over the bottle," he commanded, his voice carrying an edge that made even the remaining onlookers flinch. The girl clutched the empty beer bottle tighter, her knuckles turning white against the brown glass. "Or what?" she challenged, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. The confidence in her voice wavered slightly, like she was finally realizing this game of hers might have gone too far. Her designer shoes splashed in a puddle as she took a small step backward. That slight retreat sparked something in Mike's mind, a dangerous mix of authority and anger. He'd seen that look countless times before, privileged kids who thought they were untouchable until reality finally caught up with them. Without thinking, he reached for the bottle. "You want proof?" He snapped, his fingers closing around the glass. "Let's see how you like being on the other end of this." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. His grip on the bottle tightened, and he thrust it forward, not to hurt, but to scare, to teach a lesson. He expected her to back away, to finally show some respect for the badge. Instead, she stood her ground. The bottle's edge caught her upper lip as she tried to speak. A small trickle of blood appeared, bright red against her pale skin. The girl's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with a mixture of shock and fear that made Mike's stomach drop. "You're bleeding," he said stupidly, suddenly very aware of the phone's recording everything. The girl's friends, who had been watching from a safe distance, surged forward. "Oh my God. Did you see that? He actually hit her." The girl's composed facade crumbled completely. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks, but there was something else in her expression now, not just fear or pain, but a look of grim satisfaction. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. "I'm calling my father," she announced, her voice shaking but clear. "He's going to love this." Mike felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. He'd crossed a line. He knew at the moment he'd reach for that bottle. 15 years on the force, and he'd let a teenage girl get under his skin enough to make him lose control. "Listen," he started, trying to backtrack, to sound authoritative rather than desperate. "Put the phone down. We can handle this." "Handle this?" She laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Like you just handled this?" She gestured to her bleeding lip, which had already begun to swell. The convenience store owner had come outside now, drawn by the commotion. More phones were recording. The girl's friends were talking rapidly into their devices, no doubt spreading the story across social media in real time. Mike's radio crackled to life, someone at dispatch asking for a status update. He should respond, should call this in himself, but his mouth had gone dry. The girl was already speaking into her phone, her voice carrying clearly through the rain. "Daddy, you need to come down here right now. I'm outside Chen's Market on Pine Street." A pause. "Yes, there's a police officer here. He just assaulted me." The word assaulted hit Mike like a physical blow. He wanted to protest, to explain that wasn't what happened at all. But the blood on the girl's lip told a different story, one that would be much harder to explain to his sergeant, or to internal affairs, or to his daughter. Thunder crashed overhead, closer now, but Mike barely heard it. He was too focused on the girl's next words, spoken with a certainty that made his blood run cold. "Trust me, Dad. You're going to want to handle this one personally." The next 20 minutes felt like an eternity. The convenience store's neon sign buzzed overhead, casting alternating red and blue lights that mixed with the flashing patterns from Officer Chen's patrol car. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, but nobody seemed to notice anymore. The girl sat on the curb now, holding a paper towel to her lip. The store owner had brought it out, along with a cold can of soda to press against the swelling. Her friends formed a protective circle around her, their phones still recording every moment. Some were live streaming, others typing furiously on social media. The story was spreading like wildfire through the city's digital grapevine. Mike paced back and forth, his boots splashing through puddles. He'd called it in, he had to. His sergeant was already on the way. Just a minor incident, he'd said into his radio, knowing full well it was anything but minor. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, and he kept wiping them on his uniform pants, leaving dark streaks on the navy-blued fabric. A small crowd had gathered despite the late hour. Residents from nearby apartments, late-night dog walkers, people from the bar down the street, all drawn by the commotion and the growing number of emergency lights. Their whispers carried through the damp air. "I heard he hit her." "No way, cops don't just." "My friend's watching the live stream. Isn't her dad some big shot?" The girl hadn't said another word to him since the phone call, but she didn't need to. Her silence was worse than any threat. She just sat there, watching him pace, occasionally wincing as she touched her swollen lip. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the damage was done, both to her face and to his career. Mike's radio crackled again. Any sign of the father yet? Before he could respond, the crowd parted like waves before a ship. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up, its expensive tires crunching over the wet gravel. The headlights swept across the scene, illuminating the girl on the curb, the gathered spectators, and finally settling on Mike himself. The engine cut off. In the sudden silence, the sound of the driver's door opening seemed unnaturally loud. A tall man stepped out, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Mike made in a month. But it wasn't the suit that made Mike's heart stop, it was the face. He knew that face. Everyone in Seattle's justice system knew that face. The girl stood up, slightly unsteady. "Dad," she called out, her voice carrying a trace of a tremor now that her father was actually here. Judge William Thompson didn't rush. He didn't yell. He didn't even glance at Mike. Instead, he walked straight to his daughter, gently tilting her face to examine her injury under the street light. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes held something that made Mike want to disappear into the ground. "Officer," the judge said finally, his voice perfectly level. "I believe you know who I am." Mike managed a nod, his throat too dry for words. "Good." The judge turned to face him fully now. "Then you also know that I've spent the last 20 years ensuring that justice is served fairly in this city. I've always believed that everyone, civilian or law enforcement, should be held to the same standard under the law." The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the teenagers had stopped typing on their phones, transfixed by the scene unfolding before them. "My daughter may have been behaving inappropriately tonight," the judge continued, placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "But what you did?" He paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "Well, we have security footage, witness statements, and about 30 different camera angles to help us determine exactly what happened." Mike's sergeant chose that moment to arrive, lights flashing but no siren. As if this situation needed any more attention. "I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing in the morning," Judge Thompson announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathered crowd. "Not because of who I am or who my daughter is, but because this is what any parent should do when someone sworn to protect and serve does exactly the opposite." The sergeant was walking toward them now, his face a mask of concern. But the judge wasn't finished. "Officer Chen," he said, checking the name tag on Mike's uniform. "I've seen many police officers in my courtroom over the years. The good ones, the bad ones, and the ones who simply made a mistake in a moment of weakness. For your sake, I hope you can convince the review board which category you fall into." With that, he turned back to his daughter, speaking softly now as he guided her toward the SUV. The crowd began to disperse, but the damage was done. Mike could practically hear the headlines being written, the social media posts being shared, the video clips being edited. 20 minutes. That's all it had taken for his entire career to unravel. As his sergeant approached with a grim expression, Mike realized that the real storm was only just beginning. By sunrise, the video had gone viral. Officer Mike Chen sat in his kitchen, staring at his phone as the view count climbed higher and higher. His daughter had sent him 5 messages, each one more worried than the last. He couldn't bring himself to respond yet. The local news was running the story on repeat. Different angles, different witnesses, but always the same moment, him shoving that beer bottle, the girl's blood, the judge's arrival. Some stations were already digging into his past, finding old complaints that had been dismissed, turning routine arrests into questionable incidents. His coffee had gone cold, untouched since his wife poured it an hour ago. She stood by the sink now, pretending to wash dishes that were already clean, sneaking concerned glances his way. "They've put me on administrative leave," he finally said, breaking the heavy silence. The words felt strange in his mouth, like someone else was speaking them. "Pending investigation." His wife dried her hands slowly on a kitchen towel. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. You've been working too hard lately, taking extra shifts, missing family dinners." She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't have to. They both knew this was about more than just overwork. The signs had been there, the growing irritability, the complaints about entitled kids, the way he'd snap at small provocations. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from his partner on the force. "You seen the morning papers? Front page, man." With trembling fingers, he opened the news website. There it was, in bold letters. Judge's daughter assaulted by police officer. A story of power, privilege, and police conduct. Below the headline was a perfectly timed photo of the girl touching her swollen lip while her father stood protectively beside her. The doorbell rang, making them both jump. Through the front window, Mike could see the news vans parked along their quiet suburban street. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, watching the scene unfold. "Don't answer it," his wife said quietly. "The department said to direct all media inquiries to them, remember?" Another buzz from his phone. This time it was his sergeant. "Internal Affairs wants to see you at 2 p.m. Bring your union rep." Mike let out a long breath. He'd been to plenty of IA interviews before, but always as a witness, never as the subject. He knew what would happen. They'd go through his body camera footage frame by frame. They'd interview witnesses. They'd examine his record, his recent behavior, his relationships with the community. His wife's hand on his shoulder startled him. "You should eat something," she said softly. "You'll need your strength today." Before he could respond, his daughter's face appeared on his phone screen. She was calling again. This time he picked up. "Dad." Her voice was small, worried. "Everyone at school is talking about it. They're sharing the video in group chats. Some kids are saying really mean things." His throat tightened. His daughter was the same age as the judge's girl. How many times had he warned her about hanging out late, about drinking, about respecting authority? And now here he was, having lost control with someone else's daughter. "I'm sorry, sweetie," he managed. "Dad made a big mistake." "But you're not like that," she protested. "You're not what they're saying in the comments. You're a good person. You help people." Her defensive hint made everything worse somehow. He thought about all the times he'd lectured young officers about keeping their cool, about not letting emotions cloud their judgment. Now those same officers would watch his mistake in their training sessions, learning what not to do. The TV in the living room caught his attention. They were interviewing one of the teenagers who'd been there. The kid was describing how scared they'd all been, how they'd never seen a cop act like that before. "The chief wants to meet with you privately before the IA interview," his sergeant's next text read. "Says it's important." Mike closed his eyes, remembering the judge's words from last night. The ones who simply made a mistake in a moment of weakness. That's what this was, wasn't it? A moment of weakness. But in his line of work, moments of weakness could end careers, could change lives. His wife's voice cut through his thoughts. "Whatever happens today," she said firmly, "we'll face it together. But you need to be honest with them, Mike. Completely honest." He nodded slowly, knowing she was right. The truth would come out anyway. It was already out there, being shared and reshared, commented on and analyzed by thousands of strangers who'd never met him, never worked a late-night patrol, never had to make split-second decisions. The news vans outside had multiplied. More neighbors were gathering on their porches, pretending not to stare. In 4 hours, he'd have to face internal affairs and explain himself. In the meantime, all he could do was watch as his mistake played out again and again on screens across the city, wondering how a single moment of lost control could unravel 15 years of service. The Internal Affairs office felt colder than Mike remembered. He sat in the small interview room, his union representative to his left, watching as Lieutenant Rodriguez spread photographs across the metal table. Each image captured a different angle of that fateful night. The beer bottle, the blood, the crowd of witnesses with their phones raised high. "Let's go through this one more time," Rodriguez said, her voice professional but not unkind. She'd known Mike for years, had even worked patrol with him back when they were both rookies. Now she was on the other side of the table, duty-bound to investigate him. "Your body camera footage shows you approaching the group at 11:47 p.m., she continued, sliding forward a screenshot. "What made you stop?" Mike's union rep, a retired officer named Pete, nodded slightly. They'd practiced this. "Tell the truth, but stay focused on the facts." "I observed multiple juveniles with what appeared to be alcoholic beverages," Mike replied, his voice hoarse. "Standard procedure would be to—" "We know standard procedure," Rodriguez interrupted gently. "What we need to understand is what happened next." The air conditioning hummed overhead as Mike struggled to find the right words. How could he explain that moment when everything went wrong? When 15 years of training and experience got pushed aside by something as simple as a teenager's smirk? Outside the interview room, phones rang and officers walked past, their voices muffled by the thick glass. Life at the precinct went on, but nothing felt normal anymore. His locker had been cleared out yesterday. His badge and gun were locked away in evidence, along with his uniform from that night. The girl, Rodriguez said, pulling out another photo, had no prior record. Her blood alcohol level came back negative. The beer bottles at the scene were all empty, collected from a nearby dumpster. They were just kids playing pretend, Officer Chen. That hit him hard. He'd assumed, but then that was the problem, wasn't it? He'd made a lot of assumptions that night. The interview continued for hours. They reviewed every second of footage, every witness statement. His recent record came under scrutiny. 3 complaints in the past month about aggressive tone during routine stops. Nothing serious, all dismissed, but now they formed a pattern. Your sergeant mentions you've been under stress lately, Rodriguez said, checking her notes. Working extra shifts, family pressures. That's not an excuse, Mike cut in. I know that. Pate shifted in his chair. My client acknowledges his actions were inappropriate, but his record isn't on trial here, Rodriguez reminded them. This specific incident is. She pulled out one final photograph. A close-up of the girl's face from the hospital, her lips swollen and bruised. The media's calling this police brutality. The judge's daughter is all over social media, giving interviews about abuse of power. But you know what's interesting? Mike looked up, surprised by her tone. Judge Thompson hasn't pushed for criminal charges. In fact, he's been remarkably measured in his public statements. Almost like he's waiting to see how the department handles this internally. The implication hung in the air. The judge, known for his harsh sentences in police misconduct cases, was giving them space to handle this properly. A knock at the door interrupted them. Rodriguez's partner stepped in, holding a tablet. You need to see this, he said quietly. They all watched as a new video played, security footage from the convenience store, captured weeks before the incident. It showed the same group of teens, including the judge's daughter, harassing an elderly customer, mocking him as he struggled with his walker. The store owner had finally found the footage after seeing the news. This doesn't excuse what happened, Rodriguez said carefully. But it adds context. These kids weren't exactly innocent bystanders. Mike felt sick. They were still just kids making stupid choices. I was supposed to be the adult, the professional. Pate touched his arm. This could help your case. Show that the group had a history of problematic behavior. But Mike shook his head. No, I was wrong. Whatever they did before, whatever they might have done after, I was wrong. Rodriguez studied him for a long moment. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the blinds. They'd been in this room for over 5 hours. The review board meets tomorrow, she said finally. They'll have my report by morning. Chief Williams wants to avoid a public spectacle, but there have to be consequences. Mike nodded. I understand. As they gathered their things to leave, Rodriguez paused. You know what the judge's daughter said in her latest interview? She said she learned something that night, that actions have consequences, no matter who you are or who your parents might be. She smiled slightly. Sounds like she's not the only one who learned that lesson. Mike stepped out of the station into the evening air, Pete beside him. News vans still lingered in the parking lot, but fewer than before. Tomorrow would bring the board's decision, but tonight he just wanted to go home and hug his daughter. The police department's conference room had never felt so crowded. Mike sat at the long table, surrounded by senior officers, union representatives, and department officials. The review board members faced them, their expressions unreadable as they flipped through thick folders of evidence and testimony. Through the windows, he could see protesters gathering outside. Some held signs supporting him, others demanding his termination. The whole city seemed divided over what should happen to an officer who lost his cool for just a few seconds. Chief Williams cleared his throat. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge Judge Thompson's presence. All heads turned to the back of the room, where the judge sat quietly, his daughter beside him. Her lip had mostly healed, but the incident had left its mark on everyone involved. We've reviewed all available evidence, the board chairman began, his voice steady. The body camera footage, witness statements, Officer Chen's record, and the newly discovered security footage from the convenience store. We've also considered letters from the community, both in support of Officer Chen and calling for his dismissal. Mike's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white. His wife sat in the row behind him. They'd decided their daughter shouldn't be here for this. What happened that night reflects poorly on our entire department, the chairman continued. It demonstrates how quickly a routine situation can escalate when proper procedures aren't followed. However, he paused, looking directly at Mike. It also shows us something about human nature, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption. A murmur ran through the room. Mike felt his heart skip a beat. Officer Chen's immediate admission of wrongdoing, his cooperation with the investigation, and his clear remorse are significant factors. So is his 15-year record of service, which until recently has been exemplary. The chairman looked down at his notes. We've also received an unexpected letter from the judge's daughter herself. With her permission, I'd like to read part of it. Mike turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the girl. She looked different now, more serious, less defiant than that night. What Officer Chen did was wrong, the chairman read. But so was what we were doing. We were being stupid kids, trying to act tough, disrespecting authority because we thought it was fun. When he grabbed that bottle, he made a terrible mistake. But I've been thinking about mistakes lately, about how one bad decision can change everything. The room was completely silent now. I don't want Officer Chen to lose his job. I want him to remember what happened every time he puts on his badge, just like I'll remember it every time I see a police officer. We both learned something that night about power, responsibility, and consequences. Judge Thompson placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. She'd grown up a lot in the past few weeks. After careful consideration, the chairman continued, the board has decided on the following. Officer Chen will be suspended without pay for 3 months. During this time, he will undergo mandatory retraining in conflict resolution and youth interaction. He will also participate in our department's new community outreach program, speaking to young people about police-community relations. Mike felt tears burning in his eyes. It was more than he dared hope for. Additionally, the chairman added, we're implementing new department-wide training protocols. What happened that night highlighted gaps in our approach to youth encounters. We're determined to learn from this. As the meeting concluded, people began filing out. Mike stood, unsure what to do next, when he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Judge Thompson and his daughter. Officer Chen, the judge said quietly, my daughter has something she'd like to say. The girl stepped forward, looking more nervous than she had that rainy night. I'm sorry, she said simply. Not for reporting what happened, but for how we were acting before. We were being jerks. Mike swallowed hard. I'm sorry too. More than you know. What I did, there's no excuse. No, she agreed. There isn't. But maybe there's a reason to learn from it. Later that evening, Mike sat in his backyard, watching the sunset. His daughter was doing homework at the patio table, occasionally glancing at him with a mix of concern and relief. Dad? She asked finally. Are you really going to talk to kids at schools about what happened? He nodded slowly. Yeah, I am. Going to tell them exactly how one moment of anger can change everything. And how sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a chance to make things right. A notification popped up on his phone. Another news story about the case. But this time, the headline read, Police Department announces new youth engagement initiative following controversial incident. Maybe some good could come from his mistake after all. Not a rusher of what he'd done, but a path forward, for him, for the department, and for a community learning to rebuild trust one step at a time. 6 months had passed since that rainy night outside the convenience store. The autumn leaves were falling as Officer Mike Chen stood at the podium in the high school auditorium, facing a sea of teenage faces. This was his 20th presentation since returning to duty, but his hands still trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Some of you might recognize me from the news, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I'm the officer who made a terrible mistake with a beer bottle and a judge's daughter. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because what happened that night changed more than just my life. The students sat up straighter. They'd expected another boring police lecture about staying out of trouble. Instead, they were getting raw honesty. See this? He held up his badge. When I got this back after my suspension, it felt heavier somehow, because now I understand, really understand, what it means to carry it. In the back of the room, he spotted a familiar face. The judge's daughter had started attending these talks regularly, adding her own perspective after Mike finished. They'd become an unlikely team, showing both sides of what happened that night. Power isn't just about authority, Mike continued. It's about responsibility. That night I forgot that. I let anger take control. And in one moment, I betrayed everything this badge stands for. A student raised his hand. But those kids were being disrespectful, right? We saw the store video. Mike nodded. They were. But my job wasn't to punish them. It was to protect and serve, even the ones who make it difficult, especially them. The judge's daughter stood up then, right on cue. We thought we were so cool that night, she said, walking to join Mike at the podium. Hanging out late, pretending to be tough. We didn't think about consequences. But Officer Chen and I both learned about consequences the hard way. The students whispered among themselves, surprised by this unexpected twist in the presentation. The thing is, she continued, we could have both just gotten angry and stayed angry. Instead, we chose to learn from it. Mike smiled slightly, remembering their first awkward meeting after his suspension. They'd sat in the chief's office, neither sure what to say. Now here they were, sharing their story to help others avoid the same mistakes. The department has changed too, Mike added. New training programs, better ways to handle youth encounters. That night showed us what needed fixing, and we're fixing it. After the presentation, Mike checked his phone. There was a message from his daughter. Proud of you, Dad. His eyes got a bit misty at that. The convenience store was still there, still open 24/7. Mike stopped by occasionally, checking in on the owner. The teenagers didn't hang out there anymore. They'd found new spots, new ways to test boundaries. But now there was a poster in the window about youth outreach programs with contact information for kids who needed help. Back at the station, things had slowly returned to normal. His fellow officers had watched him closely at first, waiting to see if he changed. But day by day, call by call, he'd proven himself again. Not as the same officer he'd been before, but as someone better, someone who understood the weight of his badge in a way he never had before. His sergeant caught him in the parking lot that evening. Got a call about some kids causing trouble at the park, he said. Want to handle it? Mike nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility. Yeah, I do. As he drove to the park, he thought about everything that had changed. The department had new policies now, better training. Young officers sometimes asked him to share his story during their preparation courses. Learn from my mistake, he'd tell them, so you don't have to make your own. The judge's daughter had changed too. She was applying to law school now, inspired by what she'd learned about justice and forgiveness. Her father had even smiled at Mike during their last presentation together, a small gesture that meant more than any official forgiveness. At the park, he found the kids exactly where reported, just teenagers being teenagers, pushing boundaries, testing limits. But this time, as he stepped out of his patrol car, he moved slowly, calmly. His badge caught the evening light, reminding him of its weight, its meaning. Evening, folks, he called out, his voice firm but kind. Mind if we talk for a minute? The kids looked nervous, but they didn't run. Maybe they'd heard his story. Maybe they'd seen the videos. Or maybe they just saw something in his face, something that said this officer understood them, even when they were making mistakes. Because that's what that rainy night had taught him, what he carried with him every day now. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. Even a police officer with 15 years of service. Even a judge's daughter. Even a group of kids in a park trying to figure out their place in the world. And as he talked with them, sharing stories and building bridges instead of barriers, Mike knew that sometimes the biggest mistakes can lead to the most important changes if you're brave enough to learn from them.